Okay, so recording has started. Okay, so open pedagogy. Open pedagogy is something that I've been experimenting with for a few years, and it's basically a process where students are actively creating rather than just consuming academic content. They're not just listening to lectures or reading something or perhaps watching videos. They're actually creating something that that demonstrates their learning, and they generally learn quite a bit and as part of the process. And the open part of the open pedagogy also includes that what they're doing is something that they're sharing. And one of the advantages of students creating things that are shared, at least within the class, but often publicly, is that it gives them a little bit more intrinsic value in the process. That when they're creating something that they're going to share online, for example, they know that people can see this later on, and it has value just from that, because they know that other people might be looking at this at some point, that it's something they might want to put on the resume or on the Vita. It's something they may want to put on their LinkedIn profile. And as such, they tend to put a lot more effort into work that's shared publicly. And because of its very nature, it's active learning, where students are taking things they've learned and transforming that into some type of new content. David Wiley, the founder of Blooming Learning, refers to this as non-disposable assignments, because so much of what we do in evaluating students' work is something that they write up something, they either turn it in on paper or they submit it to the learning management system. And then they get it back at the end of the term, if it's in paper, typically. If it's online, they get it back electronically, but it's generally, unless they've saved a copy, stuck in the learning management system, and then they lose access to it as soon as the course is done. So they put a lot of work into things, and typically only they and the instructor get to see their work product. And in a sense, they're just disposing it at the end of the semester. And when they're doing something with active learning, they're creating something that lasts and persists beyond the current semester, which again gives them more value. Many open pedagogy projects involve some form of service learning, where students might be creating something that's used to assist other students in the future. It might be used for high school students, or it might be some type of a general public service where they're creating a resource that has value, again, beyond just for the classroom. And we'll see some examples of that. Some common examples are just annotating online content, and that's a pretty easy open pedagogy project where you can take online materials and annotate it using Hypothesis or some other tool, which can do a little bit of collating and also is a way of sharing material that they've discovered. A more common project, though, is to create blogs. And using WordPress or a similar tool, students create blogs where they share something that they're learning, or they could be sharing their learning journey. Or if students are engaged in international travel or studying abroad, their blogs would reflect that journal or would describe it. A common use, though, is just to have students describe what they're learning and what they learned that week and so forth. Which involves a bit of metacognitive reflection and development. Another common open pedagogy project is creating wikis. And the Wiki Foundation will provide materials. WikiEDU will provide resources and some training for students to create specific wikis. And in general, students are contributing to the overall stock of knowledge out there. And there's some interesting projects that I've seen. For example, there were students who were in a Texas city. I think it was, well, I forgot which city it was, but in any case, they were in a Portuguese language class. And what they did basically is they created information, they created a wiki for their city on a Portuguese language wiki. So they were using their language skills to share in the language the language where they were acquiring skills, a wiki about something they knew about their city, about its history, its origins, its features, and so forth. So it was an interesting project where they were creating material that would be useful for people in other cultures and other languages while becoming more proficient in the language. A really common project too is to create glossaries. We had a class here on campus about 4 years ago where it was in the theater department where students were creating glossaries of terms in Shakespeare plays, for example, because much of the Old English involves terms that are just not that common for people today. And so they were looking up the history and evolution of the terms and the context in which they were used by Shakespeare, for example. So also people do that where they're working with various disciplines so that they create glossaries that could be used by students in other classes and anywhere in the world. Podcast projects are another way in which students can work on this. Vanderbilt had a whole series of podcast projects done in multiple classes. And the best ones ended up on this Vandybox podcast series, where the best podcasts were selected from individual classes, submitted to a review panel, and then the best podcast across all those classes went out publicly on a separate channel. But it's a way in which students can have a lot of fun. Instead of doing a research paper, which they've done typically many, many times in many disciplines at least, it gives them a chance to express themselves in a different way. In my class, well, I've been using this, for example, in the last 3 years in an introductory economics class, and I used it in the capstone class this past spring, where students worked in small groups, and in their groups, they created 2 podcasts each, which will be going online as soon as I finish this workshop series. I've been a bit tied up since the end of the semester, but they put a lot of work into it and created some interesting podcasts about topics they were studying in class. Videos are another common tool that students often enjoy creating. And again, it's an alternative to creating a paper, and it involves just as much work. Oh, and going back to the podcast project, before that, for the previous 4 or 5 years, students were creating an open pedagogy project, which was a book on a specific topic, where they worked through the beginning to the end of the semester in small groups. Each group would work on a chapter, and they worked collaboratively to put together a book where it all fit together reasonably well, to a greater or lesser extent from year to year. With podcasts, they chose that option. I gave them options each year of what they wanted to do as their final projects or their semester-long project. And this time they chose podcasts. And after the first one, I asked them to evaluate it. And one of the things they noted was that if they knew how much work it was going to be at the start, they might have chosen to do something in writing, because there was a bit more work in audio editing and creating for audio and making changes, which involved re-recording rather than going back and rewriting something where copy and paste and so forth is a whole lot easier. But I said, well, would you rather switch projects for the second half? And they said no, that they didn't realize how much work it was, but they also said they thought it was much more fun and more interesting, and they were learning some new skills in addition to the material they were learning. Videos can be used quite a bit too. Research projects can also be publicly shared. I know there's a lot of classes out there when students research, or the best research projects from classes are shared online. In fact, I got one of them submitted as a paper in my econometrics class this year from a school in Georgia, which was a very well-written paper. Unfortunately, it was not written by the student who submitted it. But again, if students are doing some interesting research, having them publish that online is something that they can share, so that when they go out in the job market, or if they're applying to grad school, they can link to that and people can see the quality of their work. Portfolios are another type of open pedagogy project. Many schools use e-portfolios over the entire course of a student's stay in college, where they post samples of the work and show the progress of their development. Book projects, I mentioned my students had done that in my classes for several years. And again, they generally found that to be quite rewarding. And one of the things they said at the end of the project was that they had something that they could show their families, they could show their friends, that this is what I've been learning about for the last 4 years. And they also liked the fact that it was online, they could link to it, and they could share it with, again, potential employers in the future, or share it with graduate schools they were applying to. And so I've already suggested some of the reasons why you might want to use open pedagogy. One is student motivation. Students find these projects much more fun than the same type of project they've been doing all through their educational career. I already mentioned that non-disposable nature. The public audience of this is something that students take fairly seriously. I remember one time, my first experiment with this was probably about 15, 16 years ago, where I was teaching a history of economic analysis course, basically had an overview of how economic theory developed from the Greeks up to the present time. And the textbooks were all very, very expensive and very encyclopedic. And so I thought it might be more interesting for students to go back to the original sources, most of which were available for free, and create their own resources and summaries. So I had students create a wiki of, again, that essentially served as the equivalent of the textbooks, where each student was selected. I gave them a list of economists or schools of economic thought, and each student picked either one school of economic thought or one economist that made significant contributions, and created a wiki page about their contributions and posted that publicly. And I told them at the beginning, I have a lot of people, I know a lot of economists out there who work in the history of economic thought. And I said, they will be periodically looking at your pages and commenting on it. And the fact that this was something out there publicly that other people could see caused them to take the work, again, much more seriously than if I was the only person viewing the work. Plus, they were doing some peer review and discussion and so on, and it worked really, really well. Again, it's active learning because they're actively engaged with the material. Some issues to consider. The first one, of course, is that open pedagogy projects shouldn't be done just because they're fun. They should tie to the learning objectives for your course. So whatever you're doing, it should be something tied, and this is pretty obvious, but there have been some cases of open pedagogy projects I've seen that don't always do this, not on our campus, but in other places. One of the issues that comes up, not as often as I suspected it might, but sometimes students might have some privacy concerns. They might not want things out there on the web. For example, if any student has been involved in an abusive relationship and they don't want people to know their email address or where they are and so forth. I haven't had any students in a witness protection program, but I have had students who were in abusive relationships and didn't want to have things published publicly under their name. Sometimes we might get students who are undocumented, and they often would not want to see their name out there online and so forth. But there are ways of addressing this. You can either give them an alternative assignment, or you could have them publish under a pseudonym where you know who it is, but they don't have their name out there on the web. And again, I haven't really experienced that, but I've heard cases of that from other people who've done open pedagogy projects. One of the main concerns is, as with any group project, is that students come up with a way of productively collaborating. There's always a tendency in group projects to let someone else do the work. So one of the things that's been fairly effective for me is to have students start off by coming up with a plan of how they were going to allocate tasks, how they were going to make sure that everyone was actively engaged, and so forth. One of the things I've been doing, this was a suggestion by someone who had done a book projects in SUNY Buffalo State, and she has students work, and I've had students work in Google Docs, And each student's work is just color coded. So one student will write in dark blue, one person will write in red, one person will write in green. And it makes it really easy for me to monitor how much of the work at each stage was contributed by each person. I mean, you could use Google Edit History, but that requires a bit more work tracking down the contributions. When it's color coded, it's really easy to see who did what, and you can also look at when they did it and so forth. So, but having students come up with a plan, and also a plan to work out problems, and also decide how they're going to work on it, to come up with times when they're going to work on it, whether they're going to work in person, whether they're going to work online, or whether they're going to work asynchronously. And all of those are certainly possible. But it's important that they all agree on that at the start of the project. In general, we know that students learn the most when they receive feedback. And if you're doing a lot of work where students are doing a lot of working, it's really helpful if you bring in some peer as well as instructor feedback. And there's lots of really good tools out there for that. What I've been using for several years now is Hypothesis, where students' work is posted in the LMS, and then students can comment on that right within the work directly using embedded annotations and comments. And so I have students give feedback on each other's work, generally rotating around depending on the size of the class. But then I also give feedback privately to, well, I give some general feedback to the whole group when we review things as we move forward with the projects, but I also give individual comments in the grade book and so forth, at different stages of, well, at each stage of the project. One concern is that issues of copyright and intellectual integrity often come up with any type of work. And certainly since the pandemic, that's become much more of an issue, because student use of violations of academic integrity have skyrocketed. Chegg use more than doubled during the pandemic. And, one of the things though about open pedagogy projects is, while it can still happen, it's much less common, because when students know that things they create are going to be out there in public, it's more likely that if I don't catch them doing something inappropriate, someone else may. And so that public nature of it, again, tends to be an implicit threat to students that they might get caught more often because someone else might find a violation out there. I've only had, in the last 5 or 6 years, 1 or 2 cases where students were using someone else's work, and it was generally at a pretty early stage. And it's been much more common in all of my other classes, especially this past semester and this summer already, with the use of ChatGPT. But reminding students that they do need to be submitting their own work and scaffolding the work, so you're giving them feedback at each stage and they're getting peer feedback at each stage, makes it much less likely than in individual projects or individual submissions. If you want to have student work posted publicly, and if students agree to that, one of the issues you want to resolve is how it's going to be hosted. There are some free hosting sites out there. There's other paid ones. And one of the nice things about being in SUNY is we have the SUNY Create project, which is basically providing reclaimed hosting servers which will host WordPress blogs. It will host other types of sites that can be used to store and publish student work. But you'd like, in general, if the work is going to be something that students will be able to connect back to in the future, you want to make sure it's sustainable. Right now, for example, with the podcast project I've been doing, I pay for a hosting service. It's not terribly expensive, but I do, when I signed up for it, I knew I was going to commit to this for at least a number of years so that students will have access to that. The SUNY Create site, though, is free as long as SUNY OER services continue to fund it. And it's now, I believe it's in its 5th year or so. So we've had at least some degree of continuity there in availability. And again, I've already suggested that you have to find some way of evaluating individual contributions. And one other thing you want to make sure of is that with work that's being posted publicly, we want to make sure it meets digital accessibility standards. But that's a really useful thing for students to learn anyway, because if they're going to be creating any work in the future that's going to be posted online, they're going to be held responsible for making it digitally accessible for screen readers and so on. So that's something you may have to review with students, or at least give them resources on. Licensing. I've given students the choice of how their work is going to be licensed. Most of the licensing that is used in open pedagogy projects tend to be some type of Creative Commons license. And the most open one is the Creative Commons by license, which just requires attribution, which means that any work created with that could be used by anyone else as long as they cite that work in future projects. So basically, it means that anything the students create could be used by future students. It could be used by commercial publishers. It could be used by anyone out there, again, as long as they cite the source. There's no enforcement mechanism on it, but that's the most open license out there. And that's actually what my students have agreed to each semester. But there's other restrictions, and I go through each of these with the class. The CC by SA license, the share alike license, adds a restriction. Each of those additional pairs of letters adds some restriction to the basic attribution license. The share alike license means that you're free to use this, but anything that you release must also be released under a CC by share alike license, which means that commercial publishers could only use a work if they let anyone else use it for free with full permissions, which to some extent will make it unlikely it'll be used by commercial publishers, for example. But again, there's not a lot of student work that commercial publishers are going to want to, grab. But in general, it makes most students are pretty comfortable with the CC BY. The NC restriction means it can only be used in non-commercial use. It could be used by anyone for any other reason. And then the non-derivative is the other type of restriction, the ND. That's typically used primarily on images, for photography, for videos, and so forth. And what it means basically is you're free to use this in any way you want. If it's just CC by ND, no derivatives, people are free to use it however they want. They just can't modify it. So you can use it, you can share it, you could publish it, you could do whatever you like with it, as long as you don't change the original medium. And again, photographers use that all the time so that they get credit for their photography and no one's allowed to edit it in Photoshop or bring it into other images, bring other images into it or modify it in any way. And the non-commercial attribute just means you can't make profits from it. And you can combine those in pretty much any way. And there's a full description here. And there's also a nice little tool that will create a description and link to a description of the licenses that can be embedded right in any work that's created on the Creative Commons website. And one thing, I haven't done this and I probably should, but one thing that you could do is if students are going to be creating work that's published, you could ask them for a release form. And it's just basically, it's that document is available as a CC BY document. So you're free to use it, where basically students are just giving you permission to publish it so that if they change their mind later, they can, or if they decide they don't want it published, you do have a record that at least they had given the original permission to it. And again, I've been pleasantly surprised by how agreeable students have been, and the fact that they were most comfortable with just letting things go out in general. So now, that was a very quick overview of open pedagogy. What types of classes are you teaching?
I'm teaching two sections of history, 1865 to the present, and education in that time period. And then I'm teaching the social studies methods class for as well. So got three sections, two with the freshmen and one with the juniors. So I did it one time before. It was great. I'm very project driven. I want them to have some ability to like kind of own their own learning, and this is not something that I found that students did easily.
Right.
They are receptors. They want the food to come right into their mouths, and so that's difficult. I was a high school principal before I retired and came over to SUNY. So I've seen it in the classroom. I've seen it observing, and it's just it's a bear to get over, to get them to be creative enough to do what they need to do to make a quality project.
It is, because they most prefer being lectured at, because that's what they've been experiencing all the way through. It's easier and it seems to work better, and it's not as much work, and you don't get stuck on as many problems or challenges until you get to those tests. But you know, but that's something that can be postponed. Some examples of history projects. There's some interesting ones out there. Some have involved translations of, or doing some work where they take scanned historical documents or letters, or I know in one of a friend of mine is doing some work where she deals with slave narratives and so forth, where she has some early writings of slaves and so forth, where they're basically digitizing that material, and they were written narratives that have been digitized and archived and so forth. I know there's the National Archives does some similar work with digitizing historic documents that were only available as scanned images and converting them into text, basically. Let's see, I'm trying to think. Oh, another thing that has been used in some history type classes is to use to do archives of images and photos and narratives and such things, that using one of the tools we'll take a look at in just a few minutes, but there are tools out there designed to host collections of various things. They could be images, they could be narratives, etc. This isn't quite history, but there's the Fashion History Project at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where students each year add to it by putting in images of costumes and so forth, and describing them in terms of the historical trends and eras in which they appeared. And it's all stored online, and it's in a really nice framework. Some students have, well, I know actually there was a SUNY IITG grant that will be taking place in the next couple of years, where students were looking at local history, where they were looking at, I'm trying to remember where it was. It was some type of a plant that existed in a small town, and they were going to do the history of that, basically, where students were going to look at the historical documents in the community, working with the local library and the town historian, and they were going to create a website describing that project.
I did, John. I did a project like that, and I had the students go back to their hometown. It was usually right before the break, to make sure that they had some time to spend there. You know, and God knows they don't want to hang out with their parents, so they kind of got that going. But it went, the kids, of all the projects I assigned, that's the favorite one, because they get to talk about their hometown and significance. And I asked them to actually go to a specific place in their hometown. Like one kid went to the beach. She lived on Long Island, and she said this beach is vital to what was happening. I thought it was going to be a really soft project, and it was a really hard one. you know, I was excited that the kid did this. And so anyhow, so that's a really good one.
Oral histories are another thing that students have sometimes done, where they talk to their grandparents, older relatives, or, you know, older people in their communities to get histories of, it's at the tail end of this, but, you know, people who were alive at the Great Depression, or who, you know, who lived through the Civil Rights Movement, or, you know, something similar. That could also be an interesting project. There have been some projects where people have looked in the archives at the history of specific geographic places, where they create a website and show pictures or drawings or paintings at different periods at a specific site with the geocodes embedded and so forth. So, you know, there's a lot of interesting things you can do. Let's jump over to some of the tools, and that might suggest some things. If you hold up your camera and scan that image, it'll take you to this website. Or if you just want to open up another browser tab, well, we'll go into it, but it's openobjectives.org. This is something that Judy Littlejohn and I put together for a presentation a couple of years ago at the Online Learning Consortium. And it grew out of some work that we did for a SUNY project on open pedagogy. We had a Faculty Advisory Council on Teaching and Technology spend a year putting together some resources on open pedagogy, and many of them have ended up here. And so let's look at some. Well, we've been using this for other presentations as well, but the open, I didn't mean to do that. Let me go. This mouse is not responding very well. Let me try this again. I'm going to go to open pedagogy in general. The projects are just some specific ones. Here we go. And so a lot of this is stuff we've already talked about. Yeah, pretty much these are things we've already talked about, but in here, there should be some examples. I haven't looked at this in a while. I think it's under here. We've been modifying the site so much. I hope we didn't lose. Yeah, that's not it. Open pedagogy resources. That's what I was looking for. Okay.
Hidden.
We've changed our menu structure because we just did another session on this. Okay, here we go. These are some broad categories that we've mentioned, but what we've done is we've put together some examples and some resources so you can see how people have done things. So for example, here's some class blogs that have been created. So you can see those, and then if you look at the resource part, it will show you some resources and how to do that, for example. Here's one where, this was one of our podcasts where Danica Savoca, who's at SUNY Oneonta, has been using class blogs and so forth in English class, if I remember correctly. But we've got lots of these. Collections might be interesting. Oh, here's one. Well, here's a few that I mentioned, that fashion history project. This is a link to it. There's also one on the Baltimore uprising in 2015 archive, where people went out and collected narratives and information about that. And here's a series of Appalachian oral history project interviews that were conducted between 1965 and 89. And I haven't looked at this in a while, so I'm not quite sure what's going to be there, but here we go. So yeah, so they began doing interviews and did them for quite a period of time. So these are some written documents here with annotations and tags. So this is stored in what's called an Omeka site, which is one of the tools that's available in the SUNY Create websites, where Omeka basically just allows you to create objects with descriptions and tags. And if you click on any tag, it will show you all the items with those tags. So there's a pretty complete metadata structure there that makes it easy to find things. So you can, find other people who talked about the same type of materials. So these were all interviews that were transcribed, it looks like. and with oral history, there's now such good tools to do transcription that students can get a full transcript as well as the actual recording. So that's one type of project. The fashion history one is just kind of nicely done because they do focus a lot more on design and so forth, but they add to that every year. So, you've got different time periods that are discussed, and so you've got the Fez and the Ottoman path to modernity, and there's many, many more here. So you could sort by essays, by time periods, going from the ancient world up to the 21st century, and so forth. And this is also stored in Drupal, not Drupal, in Omeka, which again makes it easier to create things such as that. There's also thematic essays, film analysis, garment analysis, and this is something they build on every year. So it's a really nice project. And again,
great.
It looks kind of nice too.
Yeah.
There's, well, the Baltimore Uprising is, again, that's more contemporary history, but it's a nice little history of it with videos, oral recordings, produced recording, photos, written accounts, and email archives from, and so forth. So there's a lot of, and these were just selected examples to illustrate. There are many, many more in all these, but e-portfolios, glossaries. So, well, this was one from a glossary of keywords in literary studies. I've got to add more to this, but here's some resources. And here's two people discussing it. One was Danica Sabokers again, but also Maya Brown, who was in our theater department until she moved to a new position about 2 years ago, where she had students create the Shakespeare glossary. So we call that Love's Labor Not Lost, because it was retrieving some of this knowledge. Podcasts, there's a lot of them out there. Remixing and annotating online content. Well, this we don't have quite as much with, but here's some discussions of people who've done this. Hypothesis use in higher education involves using hypothesis to annotate materials on the web and collate it. And Scalar is another tool available in there where she's had students she's also now in Toronto, but she had students using Scalar, which is a, not quite sure how to describe it. It's a website where you can create pathways across all type of multimedia projects. So she had students analyze the work of a writer from Oswego in terms of the history, in terms of the places he was writing about and so forth. But it's something that you can view in a nonlinear fashion. So you can put texts up, different chapters and so forth. And from there, you can create links to other content. And the links can go, it's sort of like a hyperlinked document, except the links can go to videos. There can be annotations on videos. There can be annotations on text. There can be annotations on the annotations, and you can define pathways in which people explore that, or you can give branching options so that if they want to follow one path or another, you can create a fairly sophisticated branching network. I haven't worked with Scalar, but a number of people have, and it's a really powerful tool, which I imagine could be used in historical approaches. And that's pretty much how she was using it to look at the literature that this author, whose name I forget, had created, in terms of connecting it to different locations, historical period, historical documents, videos, images, text, and other narratives that all related to the fictional work of the author. So service learning, I think here there's the digital transcription examples. Oops, I guess we don't link to that. We better do that. Judy was doing this for, she was teaching a history class where she had students do some, I'm trying to remember what it was now. This was a couple of years ago. It was basically, students were analyzing primary sources and were posting about, I don't know if the posts were public, it might have been only within her class. But certainly crowdsourcing transcription of historical documents is something which might be of interest, especially if you had students write about what they were transcribing. And here's a whole host of other resources on open pedagogy. Ed Beck has been very active in the SUNY Create project. He was one of the people who proposed that. I was another one, but in any case, and I mentioned that SUNY task group. Here is a description of many other open pedagogy projects in SUNY. And we still are accepting contributions of people to this, and they just get added as they submit new materials to it. So there's a lot of examples out there, and there's many more that we didn't touch. We just wanted to find some representative samples to give people an idea of what could be out there. There was some webinars that were put together by this group and so on. So, and the Open Pedagogy Notebook was created by Robin DeRosa, who was on campus right before the pandemic in the fall of 2019. And she helped inspire a lot of people to consider open pedagogy. And she maintains this with a colleague who is a psychologist. And basically, she got into this when she wanted students to, she was teaching a course in early American literature. And what she realized was that the Northern anthologies were relatively expensive, and basically all the work in them were already in the public domain. So she decided to put together her own anthology of work, where the one thing that was missing in the work was basically the annotations that were provided in Northern anthology, but she had her students create the annotations for the public domain work and created an open source textbook. And then the next semester, they created a new version of this. And then another class there took that work and looked at it from the perspective, from a feminist perspective, looking at some of the same writings and so forth, and added new annotations in that variation. So students were basically, their work was annotating public domain work and creating their own version of the text, or creating a textbook by annotating those documents and organizing it and structuring it in a way and publishing it online. And that's an interesting project. One of my colleagues in the economics department, Ranjan Degay, has done this with with at least two works that I remember. One is he did it with, well, his most recent one was the historian's Mark Twain, I think it was the historian's Mark Twain. It might have been the economist Mark Twain, but he was basically taking, no, not Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. So he took, you know, he took an open document, a version of Huckleberry Finn, and he added annotations. He's an economic historian, and basically was putting things in the context of that time period. And he's used that in some of his classes. Before that, he did the, I think it was called The Historian's Wizard of Oz, which goes back to an interpretation of the Wizard of Oz issued made by an economist, Robert Rieckhoff, about 20 years ago, who argued that the Wizard of Oz was really in argument over bimetallism and populism and so forth. And the interpretation that Rieckhoff offered was that, you know, it was written at a time when there was a whole debate of whether we should have, you know, gold and silver both as money, or whether we should stay with a strict gold standard. And, you know, in the Wizard of Oz, what happens is you follow the golden brick road to the city of Oz, and Oz is OZ, or ounce. And the way in which people actually viewed the way they viewed that emerald city, which was the color of greenbacks, was by wearing green tinted glasses. The city wasn't actually emerald in the book. It was the glasses that were causing people to have this view of, you know, again, tying it to that. And, you know, you had a whole series of reference in there that he tied back to William Jennings Bryan and other people, and the way in which Dorothy returned back to the safety of the homeland and so forth was by clicking together, not her ruby slippers, but the silver slippers. So he brings in discussion of bimetallism, about unanticipated inflation, the redistribution of income that occurs, but it's all done within the actual document itself through annotations and analysis and separate addendums to the chapters. And things like that could be interesting, maybe not those specific topics, but looking at historical, narratives or primary sources and annotating them by putting them in context could be, an interesting project. So that's what I got. But this is a, let me just drop this into chat, this link, and I'll also drop a link to the slides in case they're useful. If you want to do anything like this and you have any questions, I'm happy to help you with any of this, because these are kind of fun projects. And we do have some good resources. We'll talk about them. Well, I've got a workshop on SUNY Create. I'm not sure, it's sometime today. In fact, it might be the next hour. I'm not sure. But that's a free source where you can create an account and basically get a blog, get an instance of a Mecca, and then you can customize it to use it with your classes, or use a blog with your classes or other sites. And it's available to anyone in SUNY, and we were one of the initial colleges to participate in the IIT grant that funded that. And we haven't used it as much as I was hoping people would here on campus. It's been used really extensively by people at SUNY Oneonta and by people at Geneseo. But Oswego's use has been limited. We had one book project come out of a class in education a couple of years ago, and Rebecca Masher has been using it quite a bit in her graphic design class, because students can have access to their own websites and their own hosting, basically, and do web projects on it. But it offers some nice tools that are available for free if you want to explore them. So,
sure.
Okay, so any questions?
No, you're quite extensive. It really interesting. It drew my attention on a number of issues that you talked about, and how I can incorporate in what I already have, and how I can start kind of like fresh and new. So this is good stuff. I appreciate it.
And in my experience, students have just really loved this type of thing, where they're creating something and sharing it. So
yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll stop the recording.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.